We're ready to install the cylinder head onto the block now, so grab myself some lovely clinical white gloves and we'll crack on. So we've got a nice new engine stand here. It is wonderful, very stable. Look how solid this is. Very, very good quality. So firstly we'll set the pistons. If I have the pure strength to rotate the crankshaft, we want the pistons to be halfway down the bores. So, oh, I'm weak these days. Gosh, go on. There we go. So with the pistons halfway down the bores, I'm just gonna have a quick look around and make sure that we've got nothing nasty inside, no bits of contaminant, no bits of filings or sand or wire, nothing like that, no hairs, no foreign objects. And now we just put a little bit of oil around the piston rings, just a little squirt of oil, and just run that around with a finger. Now, this is the last chance that we have to access the cylinders themselves, because once we've installed the head, this is all closed off. So we just want to be sure that these run nice and smoothly the first time we fire this engine up. So we're ready for the head gasket. I'm just going to reuse the old head gasket because the one I had shipped to me is useless and doesn't even fit the holes, and the old one is perfectly good for demonstrations. I know we'll be taking the head off in this video again to pull out some parts and show things in more detail. So the trickery of film. However, in real life, you should never reuse a head gasket. Absolutely terrible thing to do. You're only going to cause yourself major problems. So if you like spending money and wasting time, then by all means reuse a head gasket, but otherwise definitely don't do that. Just make sure the head gasket's gone on. This is not in good condition, but you can see the holes line up. We have these oil drop pipes are in the correct places. Everything looks good. You would find if there was different ways to fit this, in our case there's only one way to fit this gasket onto the block. But for other engines you may find it symmetrical. You'd find a top marking somewhere on there which would tell you this is the top, or a T for top, something like that. Now that's in position. We have, take a note of these dowels. We have two dowels on the block here which act to locate the head gasket and the cylinder head onto the block. And if you rebuild the block or you send it in for machine work or something like that, then these dowels could be misplaced. So just do remember that you want dowels on the block in the holes to line everything up. Now we can install the head this way. So we want to just lower this down nice and slowly, making sure that we don't knock the head out of alignment until we find our holes. Right, the head is on. It's lined up on its dowels. It's in the correct position. Now we're ready for the head bolts. Now, the head bolts on this engine come with a washer, and what we want to do is just give them some lubricant. We just want to lubricate this and just run this down. In fact, I should probably get a cloth just to make sure that the friction, these are probably the most important bolts in the engine in terms of structural integrity. We want to torque these down using a torque wrench to the right setting, and by lubricating them we make sure that we're not fighting friction. We're in fact putting the bolts in and strengthening those, extending those bolts, elongating them with the torque. That's why they have washers on the top as well. In fact, I should do all these and then install them all at once. And with any bolts that you're using in the engine, you want to ensure that they're clean. I've measured these and they're still within spec, so I'm going to reuse them. But I've given them a good clean because we don't want dirt and grime and grease in the threads of these bolts that will mean that the torque settings or the torque results that we get are not correct. So we've got our 10 head bolts. I'll just drop these in and just thread them by hand. In fact, I'll drop them all in and then I'm going to change these gloves because they're now covered in oil. I got myself some fresh gloves. I'll just tighten these in, just finger tight, just to make sure that we've got the threads running nicely. And then I will grab a socket and just run them down by hand before we torque them all the way. I think, I'll have to check the book, but I think we're tightening these down in 3 stages. That's good. Right, what do we need here? Little extension, and let's just run these down. In fact, I'll get my beloved speed bar. With head bolts, you'll be tightening them down in a pattern. In our case, we're going clockwise in a spiral around like so. All I'm going to do is just tighten them down until they are finger tight, although we've got no clearance in there almost for the socket. Okay, that's those tightened down just ever so slightly, basically finger tight. What we need to do now is torque those down to the correct torque. Final torque, 76 Newton meters. No idea how many pounds-feet that is. I get the torque wrench out, set that, and I think we go down in 3 stages. Okay, so the final torque is 76 Newton meters. Newton meters is the white measurement on the left. So I think we'll go to, how about 40, then 60, then 76. Now we have to use an extension on our torque wrench on the hole. You want to avoid throwing your tools on the floor, but you also want to avoid using extensions on a torque wrench. But in this case, it's unavoidable. So we start here, and this is where it becomes very important that we go around in a spiral. So that's 1, 2. We're going in one smooth motion until it clicks. Click, that's that. And again, click, perfect. 10. Right, let's go up to 60. This is where you value good brakes on an engine stand, because on the other engine stand, this would just be rotating around the floor. Now we go up to 76, which is our final torque. So this time we're just going to give it a double tap to be sure. To there. That's that. We're going to install the camshafts into this engine. Before we do that, we want to drop the cam followers, the lifters in there, into their bores. We want to lubricate these with some assembly lube, and I'm just going to put assembly lube all inside the bores in the block here, just so that we've got something to get this lubricated with as soon as it starts up. It's going to take a while for the oil to flow all the way up into the head. Okay, now we can drop our lifters in. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but when you take the valve train out of an engine, you need to keep the pieces together. So the valve spring, the retainer, the follower, for that particular valve should all be kept together, and that's why we've got this organizer here. On one side we have I for intake, on the other we have E for exhaust. And as we look at the engine here, if we're not sure which is the intake side and which is the exhaust side, there's a few different ways to tell, but the easiest way for me is to just look at the shape of the ports on the side, because the intake side has this additional notch in the top where the injector injects fuel into the intake port there. So I know this is the intake side, and so we'll take our intake for the front of the engine. This is the front of the engine, and we'll just drop those in. That's the last one. Once this is in, we want to go around and just make sure that these all move freely. And we can just give them a little rotate and just check that these are free to rotate and that they're all pushed down, because once we install the camshaft, we want to know that it's seated correctly. That looks good. There we go, we're ready for the camshaft. First, we want to lubricate with assembly lube these seats, these saddles where the camshaft's going to sit. Because the camshaft runs on these bearings in here, which are in good condition, and oil lubricates them. But again, the oil's going to take a while to get here, so let's paint some assembly lube into all these seats, like so. Nice generous dose of assembly lube. Being careful not to drop any down the bolt holes for the camshaft caps. So we're ready to install the camshafts, and the camshafts are marked for which they are. So this is marked for the exhaust, X for exhaust. The front of the camshaft is here with this spigot, so we can just drop this in carefully, being careful that the cam lobes don't make contact with the bearing surfaces, because those cam lobes are very, very sharp. The cam won't sit exactly flush immediately because it has to open a valve somewhere along its way. Now we can put in the intake camshaft. Exactly the same, just lower that carefully into place. That looks good. We want to keep these spigots as high up as possible, pointing upwards if we can. The cams will find their own position as they rest on top of the followers until we tighten them down. We need to install these two caps here, but these need a little bead of sealant to seal the bearing seal caps on this end of the engine. So I'm just going to use some instant gasket just to seal up this area where we install the caps. We certainly want to avoid getting any of that into the journals. That's more than enough. There we go. Just a small amount there, in fact. So we have our two caps here for the seals, and they're marked with an I and an E. So we know the I goes on the intake side here. Just push that down, and the E in there. Push those down for that 5 minutes. I'm just going to remove the excess sealant now. I can see that this one is not quite seated right, so just using a rubber mallet, I'll just tap that down. Same with this one, just to be sure that we've got this gasket sealing in the gap while it sets. While we wait for that sealant to dry, we can install the rest of the caps. We just want to lubricate the bearing surface again with some assembly lube. These caps have markings on them, so this is E2. I already put them in order on here to make my life easier. E2 is the exhaust number 2, and we know that we want to, sometimes these will have arrows. In our case we don't have arrows, but I do know that the E goes towards the front of the engine and the number goes towards the rear. With little bolts like this, I just wouldn't trust a power tool. We don't want to tighten these up to too much of a torque. We're going to, I think, 14 Newton meters on these, which is quite low. In fact, is right at the bottom of the range of my torque wrench. So we're supposed to do them in 3 stages, which is going to be impossible. So I've got my torque wrench here, a 10mm socket on there. I've set the torque wrench to 14 Newton meters. This is quite a big torque wrench for little bolts like this, but I don't have a smaller one, so this is what we're going to use. We're going to go round in a spiral pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on these bolts. The reason we go in a spiral pattern on these shafts, if you'll remember we did the same on the camshaft, it's to spread the tightening force down so that we're not, if we tighten all the way from one end to the other, we can create tension and stresses inside the camshaft here. That could cause it to warp, or crack, or cause problems for us. So that's the reason we use a spiral pattern. So we'll go around now. Strictly, we should be doing this in 3 movements. So what I'm going to do is just, in 3 stages. But since I only have 1 torque setting, which is the minimum that this torque wrench has, incidentally, when you're at the very edge of the range of your torque wrench, so this torque wrench really only goes down to 14 Newton meters, which is what we're at. And on those edges of the range, you get less accuracy. In the middle of its range, you want to use a torque wrench in the middle of its range if you can. So I've gone round and I've just tightened these down until I can feel the resistance in there. And now I'm actually going to torque them until they click. We're only really getting a slight click out of the torque wrench here. Okay, that's 2 camshafts installed. Now we have oil seals, which we need to install. I'm just going to lubricate the outside and the inside lip of these. Those are the camshafts installed. The next thing that we're going to do is install the pulleys onto the end here and look at how the timing belt, the timing system, connects the crankshaft down here to these 2 camshafts and ensures that the engine operates in sync. So join us next time for the timing system.